All right, we are reading Matthew 22:23. So 22 starts out with a parable. Um, and if you remember, we just finished the parable of the vineyard owner. We had the two sons before that, but particularly the vineyard owner is a parable about how Jews, how Israel, how the Jews in Jerusalem have rejected in the past the Old Testament prophets and killed them, and also they are rejecting Jesus, and therefore they will be judged for that. Right? That comes up big time. That's what this whole section is. The reading is actually 22 to 24. We're going to do 22 and 23 here because 24 is a big section on its own. But this whole section leads into that judgment. That's what it's talking about. That's why these parables are here. And 22 continues on with that, right? So it talks about having a wedding banquet, inviting people. It says that my oxen and fattened cattle have already been slaughtered. Everything is ready. I've set this out, right? So in Revelations and other places in the New Testament, it talks about the church as Christ's bride, right? So this wedding banquet is prepared. Everything is ready, but they paid no attention and they went away. And some of them, the rest, seized their servants, mistreated them, and killed them. And the king was enraged, and therefore he sent out his troops, killed those murderers, and burned down their city. Now, this is back-to-back parables where Jesus is clearly, very, very, very clearly saying, here is Israel rejecting my prophets and rejecting Jesus specifically. And the judgment for that is absolute destruction and death. He did not pull any punch. He wasn't like, well, woe to you, which he does sometimes and says, it's going to be bad. He's pretty much, yeah, you're going to be destroyed. It's not going to be good, right? So that's going to come up as we discuss AD 70 and some of the later stuff, right? But then what does he do? He opens his doors and he says, go out where the roads exit the city, right? Outside of the usual, basically outside of Jerusalem is what he's kind of saying. Invite everyone you meet to the banquet. So they go there and they find both evil and good. And the wedding banquet is filled with guests. But here is an example of the evil, right? There was someone not ready. So he said to him, how did you get in here if you're not ready? Right? And the king told him, tie him out into the outer darkness where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So this is an example of sort of that visible versus invisible church, right? There are people that are what they call invisible church. They are true believers. God has a lot of parables about this, the wheat and the tares and all these different things, right? There are times where you're not going to be able to tell you and I who is a genuine Christian. You don't know. That's just the way it is, right? There will be lots of people around, and when the end comes and God sorts things out, some of those people will be going straight to heaven, and others will not be, right? And this is just sort of another example of that. For many are invited, but few are chosen. So then it goes on into another one. Pharisees, as always, are trying to trap Jesus. So they sent to him and said, hey, by the way, do we lawfully pay taxes to Caesar or not? Right? So this is sort of a damned if you do, damned if you don't type of question, right? So if you say, yes, we pay taxes, you're supporting the Romans. If you say, no, don't pay taxes, then you're breaking the law. So perceiving their malicious intent, Jesus says, why are you testing me, hypocrites? I love it. So yeah, he's very subtle. I love how people always talk about he's just so loving and all whatever. Like these people ask him a question, they come and say, oh, hey, by the way, should we pay our taxes? And he says, why are you testing me, hypocrites? Show me the coin you use for the tax. So they brought him one. Whose image and inscription is this? Caesar's, right? So that coin was inscribed, basically saying Caesar is God, give or take. Right? Don't want to get into all the details, but give or take, it says Caesar is God. So we already mentioned previously, a video or two ago, that those coins weren't even allowed in the temple. That's why the money changers were in the temple, was because those types of coins weren't allowed in the temple because of that. Right? So basically, he says, well, then, fair enough. If it's got Caesar's name on it and an idol on it, give it to him and give to God what is God's. So then they're like, we didn't get him. And they go away. Right? So that doesn't end the story. At this point, the Sadducees come. Now, the Sadducees are another group of pompous religious leaders that don't believe in the resurrection. Right. So they're coming and they're trying to trip him up on the resurrection. So they say, well, this woman, she gets married, her husband dies, she's given to his brother, he dies, given to a brother, keeps going, right? So what happens in heaven? Which one is she married to? And basically what they're trying to trap him in is that basically it was frowned upon, but in some places allowed for men to have more than one wife. It was not allowed for women to have multiple husbands. So they're sort of like, so in heaven, this woman's going to have all kinds of husbands, right? So they're just trying to point out some inconsistencies as they sort of think it. And he says, basically, look, you don't really get how this all works, right? The heaven isn't about who you get married to or whatever else. You'll have moved beyond that by that time. And concerning the resurrection of the dead, haven't you read what was spoken to you by God? I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. He's not the God of the dead, but of God of the living. And they didn't really like that, right? So when the Pharisees see he had silenced the Sadducees, they came together, right? So this is like back and forth. The two groups are fighting with each other as they're trying to trap Jesus, right? So they come and they say, Teacher, which command in the law is the greatest? And Jesus says this several times in various different forms. But he says, Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. In Mark, he adds strength to that. If that seemed to roll off your lips, that's because in one version it adds strength. In the, I believe, without testing me, without having looked this up beforehand, but I believe in the Old Testament, Deuteronomy, it says heart, soul, and mind. Hebrew words, but roughly translated that. But I think that in Mark, it was added strength as well. And some of that can be down to the Hebrew words, not exactly lining up with the Greek words. But kind of side point. Nitpicking if you're curious. And then that is the greatest and most important commandment. The second, love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets. And I actually like this. All the law and the prophets depend on these commands, right? So he's not saying I've abolished anything that has come before. He's not saying this is all silly, that, forget everything the prophets and the law said. He's saying here is the foundation for those. And that is to love God first and then love others as you would love yourself. So, and then Jesus turns the tables a little bit, says, hey, by the way, what do you think about the Messiah? Whose son is he? And they say, of course, David's, right? And then how is it that David, inspired by the Spirit, calls him Lord? So David calls the Messiah Lord. Lord declared to my Lord, right? So God declared to my Lord, who David was writing, saying, David has a Lord, sit at my right hand till I put my enemies under your foot. That was clearly a messianic prophecy in Psalms. This is actually the most quoted Old Testament verse in the New Testament, right? So if David calls him Lord, then how can he be his son? Basically, what he's saying is they had all predicted that someone from David's line, one of David's sons, which Jesus is, would come to be king. But they are thinking and predicting a king like David. Someone will just a normal, everyday person that is just going to come along and free them from the Romans and make a great nation, right? That's what they're expecting. And Jesus is saying, well, how can that be if David calls him Lord? Because then clearly he's not just one of his sons that comes along. And no one was able to answer that. So then they didn't question him anymore. Interesting, right? So then we go into chapter 23, and Jesus is speaking to the scribes. He's warning them again to watch out for the Pharisees, having big phylacteries and tassels. So in the Old Testament, we're supposed to have these phylacteries with a little verse in it that hang from either your hair or your elbow or different things, and you have to have tassels, certain colored tassels with certain threads in them on your robe. So these people try to make their phylacteries really big so they stick out, and the tassels really big just so that they can show up. And Jesus is saying, yeah, don't worry about that. Don't worry about important people. That's what this whole section is, 8 to 12. Don't be caught up in getting titles and getting names, and don't listen to people who are big on getting titles and names. So you're not really a rabbi. Don't call anyone on earth your father because you have one father in heaven. Not meaning your father, your physical father, but meaning a spiritual leader. So Catholics hardest hit when you say that. So they just, if you're curious, Catholics they refer, as far as I understand, to a number of other verses in the New Testament and stuff where they talk about, say, the Old Testament fathers, or they use the example of fatherhood, and they sort of say that because of that, it is okay. I don't think there are any like explicit using father as a title or an honorific in the New Testament, and I would guess he doesn't because it's pretty specific. Says no, you're not supposed to there. But anyway, point here is don't lift up your earthly spiritual leaders, lift up Jesus, right? Those who are humble will be exalted. Then we go into what is called the seven woes. You've got one woe, two woe, three woes on this screen, and we've got four more woes on the second screen, right? I won't go through all of them because most of them are pretty straightforward. They're just sort of woeing the religious leaders of the day and saying, basically, they make up little rules about oaths. They are just basically have hard hearts when they should not, and they should be doing godly things. So, you're tithing, but you're not actually caring about people and justice and mercy and faithfulness. And you're whitewashed tombs, but you've got dirty bones on the inside, etc., etc. Then it says, snakes, brood of vipers, how can you escape from being condemned to hell? And it's then again, it says, this is why I'm sending you prophets, sages, and scribes. Some of them you'll kill and crucify. Some of them you'll flog in your synagogues and pursue them from town to town. So this is another key verse. This is what we're leading into. I'm just trying to build you up and sort of saying, this is where we are in the book, right? So all the righteous blood shed on the earth will be charged to you. From the blood of the righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar, right? Not only is that A to Z in our modern parlance, it works perfect. It's also Abel is at the beginning of Genesis. Zechariah is at the end of Second Chronicles, I believe, is the last book in the Hebrew Bible. Yes, Second Chronicles. So it's the sort of first person killed and the last person killed on behalf of for being a prophet or a child of God, right? So it sort of fills all of that up as saying that's all going to fall on your shoulders, right? So Jesus is in a real judgment phase right here, right? And he's moved that way through the book, right? You start out the seven woes, this section, it goes on from the seven woes through 24, 25, and a few parables at the end, right? But this teaching, this section where it's going through is sort of a bookend to the Beatitudes that started this off, right? You had the Beatitudes and you had all those sections of where God was explaining how the law should be really written on your heart. And then it's come all the way full circle. This is the last teaching saying, here are the consequences. This is, judgment is coming for you people. And it finishes right here, Jerusalem, 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 who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you weren't willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. That means abandoned, basically. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Now, this see me again is sandwiched in between this verse right here. All these things will come on this generation. And the second verse, technically, of chapter 24 talks about the destruction of the temple. That, this temple will be torn down, not one stone will stand on the other. That happens in AD 70. This says, I would tell you, these come in this generation. Generations are typically looked at as 40 years, which would be AD 70. So in between those two, right, it says, you will not see me again until it says, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So that is a setup for chapter 24. We're going to do 24 on its own. It's the Olivet Discourse. It's a long sort of prophetic sort of judgment end times type of chapter, and it's pretty deep, so I didn't want to mix it into this, but this is a setup to that, to sort of say, hey, this generation, this near-term language comes up a lot, and we will expand on that in 24. So I pray you are enjoying this and that you are being edified by reading the Word of God. God bless.